I was watching Al Jazeera and cheering on the crowds there in Tahrir Square, like most of the people around the world. And it wasn't. There were a couple of things that kind of pointed me in the right direction. One was an op-ed piece in the Washington Post. I think it was on February 3rd by none other than George Soros. It was titled "Why Obama Has to Get Egypt Right." And in that op-ed, Soros was urging Obama, whom he had helped get elected, to come out on the side of the protesters. He suggested that he would, his foundations would contribute what they could and so on. And, you know, anybody who knows about what happened in Eastern Europe with the fall of communism, the subsequent colour revolutions, know the role of George Soros, the key role of George Soros and his Open Society Institute and his collaboration with US government agencies, USAID, near governmental organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, their affiliates, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, and so on. Know that when George Soros is talking about democracy, he's really talking about opening up those countries to his investment opportunities. So that was the first thing that made me suspicious. I wrote a piece on that called El Baradei, Soros's Man in Cairo. In that op-ed, Soros said that it was a hopeful sign that the Muslim Brotherhood was cooperating with Mohammed El Baradei, former UAE chief. And Soros neglected to mention, however, that El Baradei was a board member of the International Crisis Group, which was founded and financed by Soros. And that was before, of course, he gave up his board membership on return to Egypt. The second thing that really, confirmed my suspicions was I just happened to be looking at Mondo Weiss, which is another very good blog that's critical of Israel, focuses a lot on Palestine and also the Israel lobby's influence in America. But Mondo Weiss is like most critics of Israel, gung-ho in their support for the Arab protesters. But I noticed a blog entry referring to an Al Jazeera program. It was called Egypt Seeds of Change. There's a series of programs, I think it's Power and People, on Al Jazeera. So I had a look at this program. It was aired on February 9th. It was amazing. They said this is not a spontaneous revolution, and they interviewed the leaders of the April 6th youth movement, which were shown organizing and directing the protests from the very start. And what was even more amazing was they interviewed a Serbian called Srđa Popović. Srđa Popović was one of the leaders of the Otpor youth movement that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in 2000.
The fist is also prominently displayed on the Facebook page of the April 6th youth movement. Here people can find out about the Egyptian group and its activities via blogs, links, and over Twitter. Visitors are greeted with the song Allahu Akbar, Allah is great. But religion isn't the focus here. The fist symbol is an import, and Ivan Marovic is the man who's been exporting it. He's happy about his role in the Egyptian revolution. Marovic is a Serb who lives in Belgrade. Years ago, he traveled to Egypt for the first time and stays in contact with people there over Facebook. Information is the key, and that's what makes the internet so important. Today, Otpor is called Canvas, but the people behind it are the same. With the help of the internet, they train revolutionaries around the globe. Their methods are studied the world over. It's an open secret that the US and Europe helped finance Otpor's fight against Milosevic. Its successor organization, Canvas, has no trouble finding takers for its services.
It's like a company would always say, no, we are driven by idea. but it's a very good business now. It's a business for them. You know, they run Otpor Enterprise, and Otpor Enterprise, you know, is going around selling their services.
But maybe it's money well spent. After all, the wars against Milosevic cost the West billions.
Of course, the Otpor movement was funded and trained by the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, and an interesting character called Colonel Robert Helvey. Helvey was a defense attaché at the American Embassy in Burma, and he's a close associate of a Harvard academic called Gene Sharp. Sharp is referred to as the Clausewitz of non-warfare. There's actually there was a piece I later came across in, I think it was in the New York Times. It's a shy U.S. intellectual creative playbook used in revolution. So it talks about Gene Sharp, whose book From Dictatorship to Democracy, which is a guide to toppling autocrats. It's available for download in 24 languages. This has been used to inspire the dissidents in Serbia and later on in Eastern Europe. Actually, Popovich created a group in 2003 called Canvas, the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategy. And this group then taught workshops in Georgia, which led to the Rose Revolution in 2003. They were involved with a group called PORA in the Ukraine, which led the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine in 2004, and so on. And this group is very closely related with a guy called Peter Ackerman. Ackerman, he studied under Gene Sharp, and before moving to Wall Street, and in Wall Street he worked for the Drexel, Burnham and Lambert, the infamous investment firm that went bankrupt in 1990 after the junk bond scandal. Ackerman was an aide to Michael Milken, the junk bond. Ackerman made about $500 million. But unlike Milken, who went to jail for 10 years, 4 months before the collapse of Drexel, Ackerman, as the Business Week put it, beat a fortuitously timed retreat to an institute in London, where he made an improbable transformation from junk bond promoter to nonviolent democracy promoter. Ackerman was funding the Gene Sharp's work through the Albert Einstein Institute while he was at Wall Street, and later on he set up his own group called the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. Ackerman also has been a chairman of Freedom House. Freedom House between 2005 and 2009. Freedom House, if you look at their website and just take a look at their board of trustees, you see names like Thomas Dine. Thomas Dine was the head of AIPAC in the 1980s, I believe. Max Kampelman, Chairman Emeritus of Freedom House. Kampelman is one of the ex-Trotskyites, followers of Max Shachtman, who created the neoconservative movement. Kenneth Edelman. Edelman wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in 2002 saying that the invasion of Iraq would be a cakewalk. You have Paula Dobriansky, another one of the neoconservatives, who's also, when she's not in a neoconservative think tank, she's working for the State Department. Joshua Moravchik, another one of the ex-Trotskyite neocons, and a very interesting character called Mark Palmer. Mark Palmer is a former State Department official. He wrote a speech in 1982 that Ronald Reagan gave to the British Parliament about democracy promotion. This speech led to the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy in 1993.
Let us now begin a major effort to secure the best, a crusade for freedom that will engage the faith and fortitude of the next generation. For the sake of peace and justice.
National Endowment for Democracy was also an important figure here was Alan Weinstein. Weinstein famously said that we do today what the CIA did 25 years ago. In other words, the National Endowment for Democracy is carrying out the regime change in a more overt way than the CIA did previously.
This is what U.S.-backed regime change used to look like back in the days. In a bid to ensure U.S. political and economic interests were safeguarded, a new concept for regime change was born, one that sounds and looks better: democracy promotion. The concept of democracy promotion is simple: finance, train, and politically back local opposition forces around the world that support Washington's agenda.
So the U.S. set up these different mechanisms now for penetrating the civil societies and the political systems of countries that are going to be intervened, and to assure that the outcomes would be pleasing to Washington's foreign policy objectives.
And like the CIA, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and a slew of similar organizations receive funding from Congress.
You only have to look at some of these people and their connections. For example, Mark Palmer wrote a book in 2003 titled "Breaking the Real Axis of Evil: How to Oust the World's Last Dictators by 2025." Again, it sounds great, but Mark Palmer, in the acknowledgements to his book, he says, "Peter Ackerman and Max Kampelman encouraged me to think through a strategy and tactics to achieve a 100% democratic world." Again, it sounds great until you find out who the likes of Peter Ackerman and Max Kampelman are and what they stand for. For example, Ackerman attended the 2008 Herzliya Conference, which is the major annual conference for Israeli government and intelligence. And at that conference, Ackerman participated in a roundtable discussion entitled "The Challenge of Radical Islam." Around the table with him was Uzi Landau, who was Ariel Sharon's Minister for Internal Security and a current member of the Knesset for Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Betanu. Other people in attendance were Judith Miller, who published Ahmed Chalabi's Lies About Iraqi Weapons of Mass Destruction; Stephen Emerson, the so-called terrorism expert, who has played a major role in creating the Islamophobia that's gripping America. And as I said before, Kampelman is one of the ex-Trotskyites who have created the neocon movement that have led to all these wars for Israel in the Middle East. Palmer has created his own group called the Council for a Community of Democracy. Yeah, and they're supported by such wonderfully sounding groups like Freedom House, the Open Society Institute, and the ubiquitous National Endowment for Democracy. You see, their senior advisors are Peter Ackerman and Max Kampelman, and another major player in democracy promotion, Frank Carlucci. Frank Carlucci is a former deputy director of the CIA. He's also very much involved in the Carlyle Group. And this leads to another one of those democracy promoters. There's a guy called Jared Cohen. Jared Cohen is now the director of Google Ideas, but before that he was in the policy planning staff for the State Department. He was advising first Condoleezza Rice and then Hillary Clinton on democratization, and also he was charged with counter-radicalization in the Middle East. And I think that's a key point here when we're talking about why these people are promoting so-called democracy in the Middle East. That's a really good question, and I haven't been able to figure that one out myself. It really amazes me that, for example, I was just talking about the Council for a Community of Democracies. There's another group called cyberdissidents.org. There was an article in the Washington Post the other day about Syria, the U.S. supporting Syrian opposition groups. Yeah, it mentions Tamara Witz. It also mentions a guy called Jim Prince. And Jim Prince is involved with the Democracy Council. Jim Prince is also an advisor to cyberdissidents.org. That's headed up by a guy called David Keyes. David Keyes worked for Nathan Sharansky. Nathan Sharansky was referred to as Bush's brain due to the influence his book had, The Case for Democracy, had on George Bush's freedom agenda.
The president went on that the book was part of his presidential DNA. It's what I think. It's part of all policy. It's part of my philosophy.
It just amazes me that Arab dissidents don't ask themselves, why would somebody like Nathan Sharansky, who resigned from Ariel Sharon's government over Sharon's withdrawal plan from Gaza in 2005.
If you believe in democracy that much, would you allow the fate of the settlers in Gaza to be decided by all the people of Gaza? Let them vote on whether the settlers should stay or go. You think they should stay?
This is Nathan Sharansky, who calls the new anti-Semitism is political criticism of Israel. Why would somebody like that? And another advisor to cyberdissidents.org is Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis, considered the major intellectual influence on the Iraq War, had many meetings with Dick Cheney before the invasion, who brought us the concept of clash of civilizations.
Yes. He has a warning for America and the West.
The main message that I'm trying to communicate is that we are engaged in a struggle comparable with the two great struggles of the 20th century against Nazism and against Bolshevism, and that it would improve our chances of winning if we understand who we are and who they are, what it's all about.
Lewis says the struggle is between Islam and Christendom.
And proposed very significantly in terms of what we're talking about now, the Lebanonization of the Middle East, where it's the breakup of these Arab states. But why would Nathan Sharansky and Bernard Lewis be so concerned with promoting the human rights and freedom of dissidents in Arab countries and Iran? It amazes me that the dissidents themselves are, as you said, the journalists in the Middle East and their supporters in the West. How come people aren't looking a little bit, behind this? It doesn't take that much research. All you need to do is go to any of these organizations and look up their advisors or trustees, donors, and so on. I would say, as somebody said to me the other day, that it's analysis by desire.
Yes.
A lot of people, want to believe that this is real democracy and freedom. They'd rather not listen to any dissenting voices like your mine or yourself. But if only they looked at what's happened in the aftermath of the democracy revolutions in Eastern Europe, the future doesn't look very bright. The profit motive, I think that probably is one of the most significant factors. I mentioned previously this guy, Mark Palmer. Mark Palmer was ambassador to Hungary in the late 1980s, leading up to the fall of communism. After the fall of communism, Mark Palmer, in association with Ronald Lauder, the president of the World Jewish Congress and somebody who was involved in the privatization of the World Trade Center pre 9/11, also a supporter of the Anti-Defamation League. Lauder and Palmer, actually, it was almost like an Austro-Hungarian media empire. Palmer was a U.S. ambassador to Hungary, while Lauder was U.S. ambassador to Austria, leading up to the fall of communism. And in the aftermath, they went into the media business, setting up commercial TV and radio stations throughout Eastern Europe. And I think that this is very interesting that Palmer is chairman of Signal One Media, an organization that is creating independent commercial television stations in emerging markets, initially in the Middle East. So, and of course, the profit motive there relates back to what you said about the cultural agenda, because Palmer and Lauder's media in Eastern Europe have come in under a lot of criticism for their the content of their programs. Yeah, I think you're probably right there, Mark. But Islam also, I think, especially what they would consider radical Islam, is a major obstacle to Israeli hegemony in the region.
Sure.
And you see that in the speeches of the so-called democracy promoters. They often refer to what they would refer to as anti-Semitic attitudes in the Middle East. For example, Larry Diamond, the co-founder, co-editor of the National Endowment for Democracy, Journal of Democracy, he gave a very interesting speech at the Commonwealth Club of California in 2008, and he was criticizing the Bush administration from having walked away from its freedom agenda after the relative electoral success of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And he was calling for a gradual democratization, which would allow time for a third alternative to emerge to what he called the bifurcated playing field of Islamists versus autocrats. This, what they're looking for is so-called moderate liberal Islamic democracy that will be friendly to Israel and even beholden to Israel after all the help they've got achieved democracy from the likes of Carl Gershman and Larry Diamond and Jared, Peter Ackerman and Max Kampelman and Nathan Sharansky and so on. You see that also in Carl Gershman, the longtime president of the National Endowment for Democracy. Previously, he worked in the research department of the Anti-Defamation League. And as we know, research is often a euphemism for spying on the enemies of Israel. But he spoke at the Anti-Defamation League's 2004 Rome Conference on Anti-Semitism, a threat to democracy. And
I'm sorry, I just can't. I can't help it.
Well, I think it is a threat to democracy in the way they understand democracy, but which is basically, I suppose, their oligarchy. But he made an interesting comment there. He said that whatever their differences, the Baathists and Islamists share a visceral hatred of liberal values that finds its most potent expression in the vilification of Israel and the Jewish people. And I think, there you can see what the pro-Israel motivation behind the promotion of democratic reform in the Middle East. It is, as Nathan Sharansky puts it, it's a way to counter the new anti-Semitism, which is political criticism of Israel. I imagine that those dictators are going to fall. Maybe some of them will hold on, but I imagine most of them will fall. And, there will be some sort of democratic regime in place. And I think within a few years, the Arab protesters will feel the same disillusionment that the protesters in Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, and elsewhere felt when they had their health and education cut and their fuel and food subsidies cut. And Yeah, I think it's ironic that on the at the time when Egyptians were amassing in Tahrir Square, there were 70,000 Serbs marching in Belgrade protesting unemployment and poverty. You know, in protest of the policies that had been introduced after the democratic reform.
19% of Serbia's working population are jobless. Those in work earn an average net wage of €390 a month. This protester said he lived with great difficulty and could barely survive after losing his job. This woman said having fewer corrupt politicians would improve the social situation in Serbia and would result in lower unemployment and less crime.
I think we're going to see the same disillusionment in Middle Eastern countries.